To the curious, the seekers, and the experts, welcome. A very significant election year looms before us, 2020. Probably at least as significant as our last presidential election, 2016. Late July 2019 saw some significant evenings pertaining to that election when a very large number of Democratic candidates assembled to share their views and to present themselves before the American people. In this episode of Poli-Psych podcast, we want to give some time to those two evenings in late July 2019 and look into some things that might not be immediately obvious to the casual observer. That is the personality types of some of the candidates and how that might impact upon their chances and upon their value as potential candidates. With me to do that are Ken. Hello, Ken.
Hi, Cindy.
And Ken, your MBTI type is INTJ, right?
Right. Yes.
And Enneagram?
9.
Thank you. And Don, hello and welcome. Your MBTI type is?
I am INTJ also.
And you are Enneagram?
Enneagram 5, social subtype.
Okay, and I'm Cindy, for the record. INFJ, Enneagram 2, Wing 1, and self-pres subtype, so don't mess with me too much. So I think the first folks that we're going to take a look at are some of the more senior, and that would be Bernie and Elizabeth. Ken, would you like to introduce us?
Let's put up Bernie's MBTI display that we have. And we have an INTJ, and I can relate to that. Just a little word about the format that we're using. It's a great website, personality-database.com, and we have an interesting format here where you can actually vote on or participate in the process of actually assigning type, because theoretically in MBTI and also Enneagram, we don't really know what these types are. It's either a survey oriented in the MBTI or a self-reporting that takes place. So INTJ, we basically have a very broad-minded coverage of issues, a fighting spirit, and also the ability to really drill down, concentrate on strategic matters. And I think people have underestimated Bernie. I was actually a early supporter of Bernie, more from an entertainment perspective. And so I have watched a lot of his direct feeds, and they're enormously engaging. He was very good at drawing a crowd. And I still believe that had Hillary not rigged the DNC, that Bernie may very well have won that election. And the turnout, I think, was very effective. We'll deal with this later in the show. The low turnout on the Democratic side, low level of enthusiasm, emotional enthusiasm for Hillary, contributed somewhat to the turnout. We'll never really know, but I think that might have been a factor. But Don, what's the feeling on Bernie's Enneagram?
Well, I do think that Bernie is a 1. Ones are all about ethical standards and right and wrong, and thinking about how to reform the system, how to make it more equitable, more just. Some of the nicknames or the names for this type are reformer, perfectionist, and judge. And you'll see the 1 can have a 9-wing or a 2-wing, the wings being the types on either side. Now, I think Bernie is not really tapping too much into the heart type, which would be the 2. I see more of him operating out of a will type. So, perhaps a little bit more of a 9-wing than a 2-wing on Bernie. But other than that, I see some of the typical, I guess you could say, downsides as they relate to politics are he does come off as angry, and anger is an issue when you're dealing with the will types, because they're all about, especially when they're in the public sphere, they're about asserting their will. So you see that, and they can come off as angry, as Bernie does sometimes. And with regard to your comment, Ken, about being drawn to Bernie in the beginning, I will also agree that he did have the potential to take the Democratic Party if it weren't for the basically compromised nature of the system that favored Hillary. And of course, she had rigged it that way. We won't get into Hillary's Enneagram type right now, because that would be a entertaining sideline, but we're going to limit ourselves to these guys. Now, as an INTJ, I want to point out that I'm also being an INTJ. I think that I have some agreement with Bernie Sanders on some things, but it's almost all in the realm of how he defines what the problem is. In terms of solutions, I basically differ with him strongly. So if you have a certain type, either Enneagram or in the MBTI, like I said, I am INTJ, then you might think, well, I'll agree with this person who's the same type. Well, no, you actually don't. There's actually even greater potential for disagreement, because you're using the same operational system, but you're coming to a different conclusion. So it actually tends to make the differences more noticeable. And I think that's all that I really want to say about that for now. But for those that are new to personality theory and analysis, you don't want to assume that you're going to get along better with people that are the same type, either MBTI or Enneagram. As far as how Bernie relates to the rest of the candidates, well, we'll see that coming up. There are a few other types coming out of the other centers, but Bernie as a will type, I think we'll want to keep that in mind as we see how he relates to the others in the group.
Sure. Just briefly before we move on, the voting format on this website, personalitydatabase.com, lists ENFJ as the second most. And the vector there that's an interesting observation. I think his extroverted feeling function was honed through a life in politics. He has been working in that field for most of his life. And as MBTI is really not a straitjacket, especially for older people. Anyone over 50 can individuate and essentially move between all the 8 of Jungian functions fairly easily with experience. And there's a strong case for him being an ENFJ then. And so now Hillary was also commonly regarded as an INTJ, and that's one problem. INTJs do not always crack through and do not always have the ability to be engaging public speakers. And I would say Bernie is extremely talented there. And so I'm kind of split between those two, but I think the refinement comes in with the Enneagram, where you can see, how that might actually be more accurate.
Curious if Cindy has some ideas about Bernie that she wants to share.
To be really honest, I'm just going to be really honest. One is overall probably my least favorite Enneagram type, and part of that is because as a 2, I kind of push against 1. I kind of wrestle with, I kind of try to depart from 1. To try to not be like a 1, because in my mind the 1 is all about systems and rules, and I want my orientation to be people. So that creates a conflict for a 2, and again, I just, not my favorite type. I don't care for anger as a means of relating. To me, Bernie seems very sour, and his face, he looks like he just ate a lemon or something. And I don't mean to be mean. There's just nothing appealing to me about this man. And I understand what Don said, that he knows how to analyze the problems. He has identified some of the issues accurately, but his solutions, again, I would echo, are way off my map, and just don't like his overall approach.
Well, I have to. Okay, we at the danger of going off topic here, and you might want to edit this out, but you had a very similar reaction to Ron Paul, if I'm not mistaken.
I did, and I do. I really like Ron Paul's principles. I consider myself at heart more of a libertarian than any other political persuasion. But yeah, Ron Paul, he's sour. He doesn't. I wouldn't say pessimistic, really. There's just a sourness to him, and I see that in ones, maybe even more in male ones than female ones, and it's something that really has zero appeal for me.
Well, you're on, and again, if you are already angered by President Trump, that anger may actually resonate with the dominant emotion, and I think that's kind of where we'll get into this later. But where the election, where some media powers want to take the election into a popularity contest, and then so at that point, anyone in alignment with that negative attachment, which is really what it is, would resonate with this sort of presentation. And I think that's one of the reasons Bernie is still around, and he really is right up at the front in popularity. I didn't check the stats today, and who knows what they really are, but nobody really thought he'd be back, and here he is, born in 1941. So the age, everybody talks about that. But we just had the Rolling Stones on tour with Mick Jagger, born in 1943. So I think aging is being redefined in a way that we may not fully understand it at this point.
Yeah, you make a great point, Ken. If you're looking to tap into anger as a way to defeat Trump, if you're angry at Trump, maybe Bernie is the most viable anger magnet. You have other ones running that we're gonna talk about, but Bernie is a man, and with the even if you want to believe in the power of women, and you believe the trend is going in that direction, and if your motive is unseating Trump, I think maybe you want a man to go against Trump, and a man that galvanizes that anger. So he definitely has that appeal. I do want to, just by way of sort of enlarging the repertoire of our audience, mention that I think I saw this whole concept presented really well in a BBC series called The Power of Nightmares, in which it says that the politicians in the past promised people things, but in this change of events in from the nuclear age on, it began to be about something else, and that's basically making people afraid of something. And you could say, as a corollary, anger about what they're afraid of, and that they're motivated not so much by greed and what they can get, as by what the politician promises to save them from. And so if somebody wants to be saved from Trump, I think Bernie is appealing.
Well, that's I could see that, and he had quite a ride last time, and there probably are a lot of people remaining who were hoping to be able to vote for him for president last time, who are still in the wings and hoping for that opportunity. And did we want to move on to Elizabeth Warren? She, I think, is our next the next person on our list.
Yeah.
Sure.
She appears to be an ENFJ.
ENFJ, yeah, that's there's some difference of opinion there too, but for the most part, I think that bore out during the proceedings, and we'll get a little more granular about the performance characteristics of each night as well that were particularly applicable to Liz Warren. I thought she was a little over the top with her expressiveness, and that was noted later, and it might have been coached in advance about that. She does have the intuitive's bookish demeanor that I've noticed in living in various parts of the country. And ironically, everyone we'll talk about today, except for Tulsi Gabbard, is intuitive in the second position of the MBTI. And she might be overcompensating a little bit. I think she was trying to come across as a forceful personality, and being paired with Bernie Sanders might have been part of that on night one. Those were the two principal top rated. The others there were some other interesting characters on stage that I had never even seen or heard of before. And it was interesting to watch them, especially Marianne Williamson had an interesting little performance there and attracted a lot of attention. But overall, I tend to go with the ENFJ. Definitely we have an FJ, but the ENFJ does have a fairly facile introverted thinking function, and Liz Warren has dealt extensively with financial issues, maybe not to everyone's liking, depending on political persuasion, but nevertheless has, of all the candidates, pursued that in active strategic battles with some of the financial entities that were concerned with preserving their status. And I think Liz Warren would be a fairly effective advocate for a little more government interference in the economic affairs, whether or not that's to people's liking. But she's still a strong candidate. And what's the word on the Enneagram for Liz Warren?
Well, I haven't compared my take with a whole lot of other people, but I have for a long time have seen Elizabeth Warren as a 1. As I said before, 1s are all about ethical systems, and this is something that I believe she has in common with Bernie Sanders. They believe they see what's wrong with the world, and they believe that they have some ideas about how to make it right. And Elizabeth Warren, when one of the things that she did in Congress was to form this financial, Consumer Affairs Bureau. And that was basically an attempt to do some kind of playing field leveling that would have much in common with Bernie's ideas about socialism. And many people see that she's a crusader for justice in a very one-ish sort of a way. And just as far as the energy goes in terms of what you feel coming from a 1, I feel that from both Bernie and Elizabeth Warren. But of course, with Elizabeth Warren, it has a little bit more of a female aspect to it. I think she's probably a little bit more in touch with her, the 2 wing, and Bernie more in touch with the 9 wing. One has to say, of course, that why would somebody who believes in ethical systems, speaking as somebody from the opposition, why would they declare themselves to be a race that they obviously aren't? Elizabeth Warren claiming to be a Native American Indian, and when she's very white looking. So I think you have to get inside the person's head enough to realize that what they're trying to do is they're trying to themselves embody the equalization process. So it's not a contradiction in terms from their standpoint to be a part of an ethical system that helps give people an advantage. Well, they're going to show how it's done. They're going to show the power that a Native American can have and use that as a tool for advancement and speak for Native American people to the best of their ability. Well, again, this is not viewed by all people in that way, but this is the kind of, I believe, self-talk that somebody that is a 1 gives themselves. So we've got to remember that in all areas of life, that these different types are fairly equally represented. In other words, say if you're in a prison, are you going to find people that are living the most moral lives possible? No, you're actually not. But you know what? There's a lot of 1s in prison. In fact, I met a 1 that learned about the Enneagram in a prison context, and they live by a code. They function under the code that of honor that criminals have, and they live that way. So I think one of the advantage, or one of the things that the Enneagram has to offer, is that it helps you to think or understand the way that another person views reality, with as little value judgment as possible. So I just wanted to make that aside with Elizabeth Warren, as I see her as a 1, but I also see, and ones are big on ethical systems, but to some of us that seems contradictory. I don't think it seems contradictory to her, so she's not going to spend a whole lot of time defending it. So I don't know if we have time to get some input from Cindy, and then maybe move on to the next.
Elizabeth Warren has a little bit more appeal for me than Bernie does, but I haven't taken her very seriously, and I was not anticipating that she would be a serious candidate this time around because of what you mentioned, Don, that she really quite publicly has been shown not to be Native American, and she's really made that a part of her public identity. And it's remarkable sometimes what these people are able to survive. Things that in our lives, if we were proven to be so dishonest about something like that, how many of our friends would we lose? We don't get away with, I don't think, as much in our private lives as these people get away with in their public lives, where they shoulder these tremendous responsibilities. And I'm not really sure why that is.
Well, I think it's partially because if people agree with or have resonance with the philosophical, especially in the feeler context, we tend to overlook the faults a little more readily. And I think that does, to be completely honest, I think that works with Trump supporters just as well. And we get a little more empathy and realize that everybody's different for a reason. But at times, if we're not in tune with the other person, we may be a little harsher in judgment. But who knows? I think it's not the first time I've heard people refer to Native American lineage, and sometimes it could be an identity attachment that occurs maybe in a relative from a generation before. So who knows? I think it probably would come up later, though. That one was particularly serious because I believe it was also used as a college admissions resume item, which that kind of crosses a line there. So we're going to talk about Joe Biden next, and just kind of a brief aside. We had the networks were televising this on 2 successive nights this last week, and I expected to be able to find it on YouTube or somewhere. It's a political proposition. I think it normally should be easy for people to find. And I know lots of people, myself included, who do not have cable, but I watch a lot of televised entertainment, either movies, Netflix, or just kind of an assortment of YouTube videos and YouTube channels. So I watch just as much television as anybody would. But I was astounded at the inaccessibility of this debate. And again, as a political, it's not like it's a major sporting event, or maybe it is, but just how that, and I think we'll kick that around later in the show, but it's almost as if the networks are more interested in making money than, because we always accuse them of promoting a political stance one way or the other, but it's highly ineffective to not have this be freely accessible. And I'm beginning to wonder if the whole anti-Trump movement, or whatever you want to call it, is really a money-making profit center for the networks, and they're cashing in on this with the advertising. Cindy, I think, had alluded to this, and we communicate, the three of us, via email quite a bit. And I guess you had to sit through commercials, and you found that a little grating.
Yeah, absolutely. It was because we also don't watch a lot of commercial TV. We do have cable. We tend to, if we watch cable, we watch something on demand, or we watch. With HBO has produced some pretty high quality shows, but we typically don't see commercials. And honestly, I felt kind of muddled from being it's almost like being assaulted by the commercials, because they've found ways, I think, to through study to get inside your head. And commercial TV. I found myself feeling sad for people who sit through presentations with commercials, because it really changes the whole experience. It keeps you like raw or on edge or something. It's difficult to relax and focus.
Well, yeah, I think that, and it's a huge psychological, at least in the MBTI, is you're locked into your sensing function, and most intuitives are more comfortable kind of stepping back from their sensing function, or at least having the ability to do that. So we'll find distractions to be very difficult to handle, because we're no longer able to carry on our continuous internal processing function that we thrive on, is kind of linking things together. And the thing is, though, most people become inured to the point where they don't notice the commercials. And it's, to me, being awake. Now, I did know there would be a contrast between our findings here, because you do have the cable. But when I experience that in a different environment, it's almost like someone has lit up a cigar in the room, which you used to kind of take that, as it was 20 years ago. But now it really stands out. And I think people are in droves fleeing cable as much as they can. But I think the networks are hanging on to a negative attachment, especially with this political issue, a negative attachment to Donald Trump. And I don't think they really even care as much about the political discourse as they do about keeping that small group enmeshed in this drama and coming back and paying that cable bill every time, because there's no other way to get it. I mean, I just literally, being on the outside of that, had no access to the Democratic platform. And I don't know if that'll play out also as a factor in the election. But moving along to Joe Biden, we have a very interesting type, MBTI type ENFJ, and there, from the screen here, we see a pretty good agreement on that. And it happens to be one of the rarest types in males, only occurring in 1.6% of the population. And I found this from being an INTJ, is that being a rare type in your gender does present some challenges growing up, and just kind of in general. And I think Joe might have faced this as well. Being an FJ, especially an intuitive FJ, it's a fairly sensitive type. And I could kind of read that in Joe. And even when he was just listening to someone else, it was almost like his empathy, he couldn't turn it off. And I don't think it was an act. And I think Joe does have a lot of appeal. He tends to resonate really well with the idealistic NF population, even though his overtly expressed political opinions are not really NF. He's not really an idealist politically, but yet he resonates well with that group, because he does sort of tune into their mind space a little better than the STs would, for instance, on the conservative side. So bottom line is, he does appeal to that sort of middle ground, and he is durable. He's there, and could become a factor. And even though people discount that, we'll see. But he'll probably hang in right close to the end and still be a force during even the convention phase. What do you think, Don?
Well, as long as we're first of all, mention the political theory aspect of it, I have to throw out there that there is a theory that Joe Biden is a placeholder for a super candidate to swoop in and take the field. And some people speculate that might be Michelle Obama. So there, I've said it. But yeah, I'm not sure how much staying power Joe Biden has. I do completely agree with you about the empathy, or the ability to, in the Enneagram world, it's the nine's ability to merge with their surroundings that Joe Biden, I believe, has in spades. He really is almost an archetypical 9. He does not have he won't take an opinion that is controversial and that would set him apart from the crowd. He'll find the middle ground and he'll stay there because that's the safe place. It's interesting because because he's had a long political career, if you go through his whole career, you can find him contradicting himself because as the political landscape changes, he changes. So those that like somebody that stands on their principles and doesn't change from year to year or decade to decade, they're not going to like Joe Biden because Joe Biden does go with the flow. He does change. And, currently he's on record as saying, well, this shift of the Democratic Party to the left, to the socialist emphasis is just fine with him. And he's not going to take issue with that. So, again, I'm not sure how well he did in the debates. And some people think that maybe he was a little too wishy-washy. Well, that's just the way the 9s can be sometimes. Although I've said that, let me contrast him with another 9 who actually did take strong positions, and that would be Ronald Reagan. He had that ability to sort of navigate the landscape and stay to some extent in the center and joke about the differences, but in a much different way. But Joe Biden, I think he comes off as a person that can be in the middle of a lot of things without creating a lot of controversy, and that has been his mainstay. How long he survives, whether he does go, continues to have the quickness and agility that is needed in today's political world, I'm not so sure.
What do you?
Well, I would kind of like to know why at one point his ears were attached, his earlobes were attached, and another they weren't, but I will say no more. Except that he doesn't have appeal for me, never has. I honestly don't see, even though he's an NFJ, I don't see what his appeal would be to anybody. I think I just realized that one thing that has appealed to me in pretty much every president that I voted for, and some I regret, but if a person comes across, and not all of the ones that I voted for have done this actually, but if a person comes across as someone who's going to be a protector, I think that aura is helpful to me. That has appeal for me, and Joe Biden has kind of the opposite vibe of what I would consider to be a protector. I don't see him as someone who's going to take care of other people. And again, I'm sure that's just relating to my personality type. I would prefer to see someone as president who is going to, even though you both have noted that he has an empathy about him, I don't feel like that if he has empathy, I don't feel like it's going to bring him into a position where he's going to be anything like self-sacrificing or do the hard thing or anything that would be required in my mind for someone to be considered a protector, as I will just throw that word out there.
Yeah, so in terms of the Enneagram, what that means is that Joe Biden doesn't have a very strong 8 wing, that's something that you could relate to, because 8 is the archetypical protector, is that you're going to fight for the underdog, fight for justice, and to take the person who can't defend himself under your wing. That would be the 8. And as a 9, Joe Biden might have some of that, but not very much that we could see.
There were some strategic problems with Joe. I guess he bobbled the the portion at the end about texting in using a phone versus it was unclear whether he was referring to a URL or a phone.
Yeah, he may not have known. He probably can't navigate that tech world too successfully.
Or he didn't realize the significance of it either. I don't know if that probably was it. But again, Joe, as intuitive, especially an extroverted intuitive, an extroverted feeler, introverted intuitive, extroverted sensor, he doesn't seem to have that on stage strength. It's in his function stack, but it's in number 3. So it probably it's just something about his decision making on site that has been off, and that's why he's been referred to as the GAF master and some other pejorative terminology relating to that performance related behavior.
Yeah, if you try too hard to be all things to all people, it's hard to see how that's not going to shake out in negatives to some extent, and there certainly is ample evidence of that.
Yeah, sure. Fascinating situation here. Kamala Harris, and many people, including myself, think that she probably will be the nominee eventually. They're trying to my feeling there is they're trying to keep her out of the limelight because her performance related behavior is not quite up to speed yet, and it could be a confidence factor. That was pointed out very well by Scott Adams during a podcast I listened to today. And once she gets that confidence, and she's still relatively young, born in 1964, and might need a little more seasoning as far as confidence goes. It's just somebody needs to just tell her that she can do this. And if not this time around, next time, I think she will definitely be a force in the political landscape. And as an ENTJ, it's an extremely rare type in females. It's listed as 0.9% of the female population. And what that generally also means socially, it's quite significant. The female population in the US and in most patriarchal cultures is heavily slanted towards the SF or the FJ, the SFJ. In fact, that personality type dominates at the top, well over 35%, I think, of the population. So you're growing up ENTJ, INTJ, all those types that are sort of at the bottom of the female stack. They do have more challenges, and it does show at times when the camera's not on her. She seems to kind of drift off and not lose interest, but just have this sort of uncomfortable aura in group situations. And nevertheless, it's a powerful function stack for any human being. Having the NT conceptual grouping, which is actually rare in the human, both genders. And again, the intuitive thinker, extroverted especially. So it's probably the most powerful of the leader profiles that you can have. But again, it's rare in women. So I mean, some of this, my own theorizing, I don't look at it as gender specific prejudice as much as just it's the way that the culture has moved and has rewarded the sensing feeler types with more children at times. And the female thinker can sometimes get typecast as being icy cold. And it can sometimes intimidate the male of the species a little more than usual, but the ENTJ will be a fantastic leadership personality. And let's see what the Enneagram side of life has to say.
Well, it's pretty similar, and I don't, okay, as a 5, I've read a lot more about these, each individual, than I have seen them. And when I go to Enneagram type, I do it primarily, or at least the deciding factor for me is the energy that I feel. But it was almost like I had a lot of feel for her energy even before I saw her, because I knew some things about her background. And this is a power person. That Kamala Harris is, her story is all about political power. And I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of it, but some people say that she got power in the way that a lot of females have learned how to get power in male-dominated worlds. So she has learned how to wield that power. Ken says that maybe she's not as confident in it as she will eventually be. Yeah, there's probably room for growth, but by and large, I thought what I saw of her in the debate is somebody who you definitely felt had political power and was not uncomfortable in wielding it. Now, I'm not sure that she was completely successful, and I'm referring primarily to her interaction with Tulsi Gabbard, in which Tulsi made an issue out of Kamala's role as California's Attorney General. Now, first off, the thing to notice is a woman Attorney General, very interesting. Well, yeah, this is a very powerful position, and she's not old and not unattractive. So this is somebody that I would pretty much without reservation say Enneagram, she's an 8. She's operating out of her will center. You feel that energy and strength coming very viscerally from her. And she has been, I believe, put forward by people who understand that. A number of people have said, well, she's the heir apparent to the Hillary Clinton network, and that may be what's happening politically. I don't know. I don't have enough insider baseball to see that. I can see that she could be a person who would be able to manage that. If not now, perhaps in the future. And then with an 8, you also have the potential abuse of power, and that's what Tulsi called her on. But we'll perhaps get into that more when we talk about Tulsi. And Cindy might have some things to say about her, Kamala's Enneagram type as such, because I know she has some familiarity with 8 females in her life.
I do. My mom was an 8, and I have a daughter who's an 8. And yeah, there's a lot of force in an 8. And it doesn't feel, it's interesting because the MBTI type is somewhat similar. Sometimes the amount of force that a female 8 uses doesn't quite seem appropriate for a female. And sometimes it's expressed as just emotionalism. But it's very often expressed because their will type as anger. And we've seen... to some extent, we've seen Kamala angry. And I would say, there's more, an angry 8 is more fearful than, more fear-inducing than an angry 1. Even though the type 1 tends to, that's considered the primal sin, to use that word, of the 1 is anger. Of the 8 is lust, and they tend to dominate, get what they want. The 8s can be pushy, and I'm sure Kamala keeps a lot of that, keeps the lid on that publicly for the most part. But there's kind of a meanness about her that I've sensed when I've listened to her, and I think she, as if the root sin is lust, I think there's a sense about Kamala that she will get what she wants, and if she doesn't, there will be some unhappy people around her. I think she'll make people she will share her unhappiness, I think, if she's unhappy. So I'm not, she would probably almost for me be in last place of both nights, of all the candidates, because of that, because of her, that kind of domineering, which, okay, I'll admit maybe that seems less appropriate because she's a female, but it doesn't seem to me to bode well for her performance as someone in this kind of executive position.
Well, she is a TJ after all, and that is just, again, it's not as socially accepted in the female of the species, but it's not a bad one for employment in that position, especially an NTJ. And whether, depending on which party, it would be interesting to have an ENTJ in the White House at some point. Maybe not this point, but nevertheless, it's, of all the types you could possibly have, it might be the best suited for a chief executive. But what you're saying, Cindy, is very true. The extroverted thinking function is number one in the ENTJ, and what that means is that the feeling function is lowest on the stack, and it's also, to tap that off, it's also introverted and would be referred to as the infantile function. So her ability to empathize on the social level would be the lowest in the function stack, in the 8-tier function stack that has been proposed in the MBTI conception. And I think that bore out in the reaction to the marijuana prosecution. I think at one point Tulsi pointed out during the debate that she had sent 1,500 marijuana violators to prison. And on both sides of that issue, well, she's the attorney general, so that's the law. The law is they can't kind of make it up as they go along, like I guess they do in New York, but I didn't say that, did I? So, but that's the job. And then if she didn't do it, somebody else probably would move in and do it. But the problem with what Kamala, how she handled it, is I haven't seen the footage, but I guess she made a joke of it when they asked her about her marijuana usage, and she had, been kind of dismissing it with a humorous aside, even though she was sending minor violators to prison, essentially. So that was a little bit harsh, but that's a TJ. The TJ will not see that feeling side of things as readily. And I'll tell you, there are times, the invasion on D-Day or wherever. I mean, there's certain positions where that's why we're all different. We're different for a reason. But let's, Cindy, do you want to move on to Tulsi Gabbard? Well, I've been following Tulsi for a long time. I went through a phase, and I'm probably still there. My own personal opinions are normally not pertinent to the analytical portion of the show, but I had followed a lot of the libertarian people for a while before taking a little vacation with Bernie, and so I knew who she was, and I know there's some contradictions in and there's some, Don will talk about some current events that are bubbling to the surface, perhaps, concerning her. But I think at heart, she does have that libertarian flair, and she is attracting a lot of flack from both sides, just like Ron Paul did. There was an article on Zero Hedge today about how that's starting to take effect. And people have ganged up on her quite a bit. It's the thing that stands out. She's an ISTJ, as we can see. And I would concur with that. It looks like censor is definitely agreed to by most of the people that were surveyed for the personality database.com page that we're on. And what stands out is the fact that she's a censor. She's the only one in that group who is a censor. All the remaining four we've discussed are intuitives, and the dichotomy between those two is very hard to explain. I won't try now, but it does tend to lead to very differing ways of perceiving the world. And I think Tulsi also has a military, with her military experience, which is not uncommon with censors. I think if we did a survey, we'd find, again, censors comprise a very large portion of the population. I think 65%, somewhere in there. And censors are more commonly, they're just better at dealing with the material world. Soldiers, construction people, anybody who has to deal with reality on a real time basis will definitely be better at that if their sensing function is really tuned into the present moment and also tuned into the past behind the event horizon, whereas the intuitive is more imaginary and more ahead of the event horizon at times. So we see this stress cropping up between her and the other candidates, and I think it's probably going to intensify. Don, what do you think?
Well, on the MBT, on the Enneagram, I see Tulsi as being probably a 3. I believe she has a warmth to her that indicates to me that she's coming from the heart center. It's not that she's lacking in the mental department, but if she were a 6, for instance, and there's a fairly high number of female 6s, I think she would feel a little bit differently, you'd see the gears turning behind her a little bit more. What I see coming from her is more emotive. It's more coming out of her heart. And I want to emphasize that doesn't always mean that I agree with her or that the heart is always, better because it's more compassionate. It's just where the energy is coming from. And we want to remember that President Trump is also a heart type, and he connects with people in a very heart-oriented way. And she has that in common with him. And I think that's very interesting. Of course, she's a long shot for the Democratic Party nomination, but the very fact that she's in the race means that there is going to be some focus on her style versus President Trump's style, and some similarities there. I do want to, but now we're going to talk in a minute about a confrontation that Tulsi had with Kamala Harris, who we just covered. But I want to also mention that in passing, and it was a very quick jab, but Tulsi Gabbard said, "Our president is supporting Al-Qaeda." So this was a quote directly from the debate in which she made that case very quickly, in probably less than a minute. And of course, many people who support President Trump would flat out disagree with that. But Tulsi says that she joined the military in order to fight Al-Qaeda, and now she believes that, and this is a quote also from the debate, that Al-Qaeda is stronger than it was on 9/11. So she seems to be setting herself up for a direct confrontation with President Trump. Now, if you don't fully understand Enneagram 3s or think deeply about them, even though they're a heart type, they're also a very success-oriented type. They're the achiever. They are the ones that want to strive for success more than any other type. Even more than an 8 would use their aggressive nature to win. The 3 is going to find out the best path to success and ensure that they get there. And I'm guessing that Tulsi would like to take on President Trump, and there are certainly a lot of people in the Democrat Party that would like to see her do that. And I believe that what she did on that debate night Wednesday was to take a strong shot at what she perceived to be her strongest opponent, which is Kamala Harris. And in that confrontation, Tulsi really took issue with the Kamala Harris's, what she would, I'm sure, call, but these are my words, an abuse of power in her role as Attorney General, and particularly as with regard to Black Americans. So here she is making a very open ploy for the African American vote, and she may have some success there. And I even saw that there are some people that said, well, that she successfully unseated Kamala Harris as the heir apparent, as we said before, the front runner in the Democratic Party. We'll have to see how that shakes out. But as I said before, she's a long shot. But as a 3, she has her sights set on success. And at any rate, that's how I see her. And I wonder what thoughts Cindy might have.
I cannot watch Tulsi or see Tulsi's photo without thinking of Selena Meyer from Veep. I know it's funny, but it's also there's something about it. I should let people know that I don't really believe in coincidence. And I'm really quite uncomfortable with the similarities between Tulsi and Selena. And of course, the show Veep has been, I think it completed its 9th season, and it's done. It's over. So Veep was going long before Tulsi was on the scene. But in the show Veep, Selena Meyer, who is the candidate who looks an awful lot like Tulsi. I mean, you can find images where they look almost identical. And Selena, in the last season, was running for president, and she was running against an African American woman who was quite a bit taller than her, whose name was Kemi, Kemi. And as I said, because I don't believe in coincidence, I'm uncomfortable. As this, I would not be surprised if this contest came down to Tulsi and Kamala Harris, and that kind of happened in the second night of debates this week at the end of July. And the reason I'm uncomfortable is because of predictive programming. And the Veep the last episode really kind of almost was. It was so tragic. It was reminiscent of the last Seinfeld episode, in which all the characters were just in jail indefinitely. And the last Veep was like that. Selena had sacrificed everything to become the president, and she was left with nothing of value in her life. And could it be a coincidence? I don't know. And if it's not, I don't know what was intended by whoever crafted the Selena character that way. We just have so many strange things pertaining to this election cycle. I mean, you've got a gay man whose name is Buttigieg, and there's just so many strange aspects of this election cycle that I'm just, I'm going to be wearing my seatbelt because I think it's going to be a pretty bumpy ride.
So we've looked at Liz Warren, Bernie Sanders, Kamala, Joe Biden, and Tulsi Gabbard, and we saw on night one almost the cancellation effect between Bernie and Liz Warren, and I think they put them on the first night for a reason. Rather unexpected results, as again, if Kamala Harris is affected, I think Liz Warren might pick up a lot of the votes that are then freed up. The second tier candidates were interesting as well, and I think they put their stronger second tier candidates on the first night and the weaker ones on the second night, so that the primaries that they wanted to hammer home. I think media has sort of looked at Joe Biden or Kamala Harris as being the front runners, and they gave them the advantage in the middle of the stage and certainly more exposure time. But there were unexpected events that occurred. But there's a sixth candidate we didn't discuss, and I again have felt that the media almost in some ways was somewhat ignorant of the political, or willfully ignorant of the political effects of not making this event more accessible to the public, to the point where I'm not even sure if even the hard-nosed strategists, aside from the profit motive of having people watch more commercial television, because again, it was virtually impossible to see this, being someone who doesn't have cable. Without a lot of, eventually we ended up watching it on a laptop. And I was very impressed with that difference in cable accessibility. But I say the sixth candidate is just anti-Trump, is almost it doesn't really matter at this point to a lot of strategists, I bet, who forces their way to the front of this food fight, because we have a long way to go. This is, what are we? We're in August here, and the primary conventions are a little bit less than a year away, and that's a long time. And I don't know how long we can keep this up, but we already see the demolition derby starting to kick in, to the point where I don't even know if it matters who runs. I think at this point, after seeing what happened with the Mueller investigation, and they were ready to indict a ham sandwich, and I think they would actually elect a ham sandwich over Donald Trump. And it's to psychoanalyze this, and I will attempt to do that right here and now. Let's look at the voting issues slide that we had, and this really does portray the position. We have, starting from the bottom up, energy, which we used to think was number one, but with the Green New Deal and so on, women's issues. And again, I'm coming from the bottom up, and it's been presented to us inverted. But right there at the top is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, is the position on Trump, which is almost, it's odd. It's not based on any of these issues that appear below it. It probably is. I say, well, gun policy, obviously, and some other things that are just obvious. But President Trump has actually been surprisingly open-minded on some of these other issues, such as healthcare. Certainly, security is a prime one, and nevertheless, we're reducing this in the MBTI world into feeler versus thinker dichotomy, or liking versus logic. And not to demean either one, everybody's got both, but in the binary choice of electing someone, which is a binary choice, one will override the other, and you're forced into a binary decision in the voting booth. And the theory that I'm following here, and I'll put it up for discussion here, is that we don't have to worry about the candidate as much as the level of negative attachment or positive attachment on each side, respectively, to the personality of Donald Trump. Not even his policies as much as, is he likable? Will he appeal to the feeler population? And let's look at the Yoda clip here for a second. And I ran across this meme today, and we're all familiar with almost I'd say 99% of us are familiar with Yoda, respected character, even though imaginary, and the great wisdom that this Yoda character is imparting. This is really telling feeler logic. We see. Let's look at the linguistic content. Fear. I'm just breaking out the elements. Fear element, anger, hate, and then a personality. We have no issues at all here. Nothing. There's nothing here that would appeal to what we would call the thinker logical. These are all value judgments, and that's the language of the feeler. Now, that shouldn't be discounted, because the logic of the feeler works in electoral situations really well. Unfortunately, I think the bad news for people that support Donald Trump, and full disclosure, I didn't start that way, but I've kind of come to that realization through a process that I would call maturity individually. Everyone has their own path in life, but that's kind of what happened to me, as I became more aware of the political impulses being a little more important than I had previously regarded it. And I think many of us came through that in the last few decades. We didn't really even talk about politics that much, and now it's the only thing we talk about a lot of the time, at least in this group. But we find that energizing, because now we've got people on our side of sort of, at least when I say our side, I say that the Trump supporting side have a plan, and we have an interesting strategic scenario and some other things. Likability doesn't come into it as much. We will like someone who's logical. I'm a TJ, as we described. Don is an INTJ also. So our liking function is definitely there, but it follows like a little caboose on the the engine of conceptual or strategic correctness, and also on the other side with the introverted intuitive function that we all share. We're all three of us are would be regarded in social terms as being more religious than not. We're more in tune with the eternal archetypes, or at least those inform our lives a little more. Not that there's anything wrong with that either way, but what we're going to find, let's look at the voter turnout, and then I'll put it up for discussion and jump off the soapbox, no pun intended. The 2018 midterms were really a wake-up call that I don't think many people noticed. And you can see the bottom part of this curve, the spike up in midterm turnout. Now, this graph's a little well, it's not that misleading. We start from a baseline 0, so this is actually the best one of the bunch, and we see that spike up. What happens in the presidential in 2020? Well, if we took that, it would all depend on the party affiliation. But again, the level of emotional upset that can be created, the level of negative attachment, will bring out the voters in droves, just like it did during the midterms. Because as we covered in the beginning of the show, at least I did, the voter turnout, this opinion may not be shared by my co-contributors here, but I think voter turnout elected Donald Trump as much as the excitement generated by the MAGA movement and the rallies and all those other things. But the leading candidate on the other side, Hillary, just didn't excite people, and I don't think they took Trump seriously. At least the media at first didn't. The anti-Trump movement began after he was elected. It was there before, but it really kicked into high gear after that with the Mueller probe and all the things that we've gone through with that deflation event playing out. But putting it up there for viewpoints on your side, Don or Cindy.
Yeah, definitely an interesting topic. My strong hunch is that none of this is a surprise to President Trump. In other words, he's basically put himself in this position on purpose. He knew that he was galvanizing the other side against him and continued to play that up. My hunch is that he is going to turn that in a certain direction, and I believe he already has. I believe it's actually relatively obvious with his recent moves. President Trump has made the opposition defend their most extreme elements, namely the 4 women of the squad. And in addition to that, there's the problems in the inner cities in which, and I saw this great meme that encapsulates it, and where President Trump as a magician says, and now for my next trick, I will make the Democrats defend rats. And that's kind of what you have happening there. And I believe President Trump is doing 2 things there. The MAGA movement is all about patriotism. So he has basically done his best to corner the market on American patriotism to the point where it's actually rather surprising to a lot of people, myself included, to find out that Tulsi Gabbard is a military person who opposes President Trump and believes he's supporting Al-Qaeda. That, I think, is going to be a very difficult position to advance. It's going to be very difficult for somebody to claim that they're patriotic and that they oppose President Trump. And I've been monitoring the left in my own way through watching the kinds of memes that appeal to anti-Trump supporters, and they're almost always of a mocking sort, in a way similar to this, the nope with the hair blowing, and the very buffoonish sort of a characteristic of Trump. But I don't think that there is no indication that is going to dissuade President Trump's base. I think what Ken is alluding to, that there will be a significant enough backlash or anger at President Trump for the his lack of sensitivity to the things they care about, that they will come out in droves and vote for whoever is running against President Trump. I personally don't think that is going to be at very large numbers. Now, I think the thing that's going to really make the difference is how much, well, two things really. The big tech influence, whether or not that's reined in to some extent, because that's a huge ability of the establishment, the tech establishment, to sway the vote one way or the other. And then there's also vote fraud. And many people think that, this upsurge in Ken's graph notwithstanding, that many of these votes in the 2018 election were actually fraudulent. So the word is that President Trump and his administration are going to really get the handle on vote fraud and essentially eliminate it. Even though, say, it's only 2% of the total votes, it is a deciding factor in a surprising number of areas. And I strongly suspect that there is going to be a major effort to prevent vote fraud in the 2020 election. So those are the things that I see happening. And I do think every member of this little group here lives in a blue city area. And we tend to be very sensitive about the influence of those that dislike Trump. We see them in our daily lives on a very often, very common. So we're in touch with that. But some of the time, unless we're tuned into a Trump rally, we forget that a lot of middle America, flyover country, is supporting President Trump. And one of the things, I'm not going on here, but I want to also address a point that Ken made earlier about the media and the lack of cable or the lack of coverage outside of cable of the Democratic debates. President Trump himself has said that once he is gone, that the network news will collapse. And I'm not so sure that he's kidding. He actually knows that anti-Trump is a big draw, that people that hate him tune into the news to find out how soon he's going to be impeached. And I don't think that he considers that to be a negative. I believe he actually understands that energizes his base. So that's another huge thing to consider. Well, that's pretty much my summary of the anti-Trump situation.
What do you think?
I don't, quite honestly, I think there are only one or two candidates that could potentially work as an anti-Trump. That would probably be Bernie and Tulsi Gabbard. And I at this point, just in a very broad sense, I would say that those are probably the only two that have any potential to beat President Trump. And most of the others are either very weak personalities, very weak candidates, or they are soiled in some way that I think is going to completely put them out of consideration of most people. I think Bernie has a chance, mostly because his followers felt like they were ripped off because he was taken out by Hillary. I think Tulsi Gabbard has a chance because she has many of the characteristics as possibly a 3, as a heart type. She has many of the characteristics that distinguish President Trump, and if there, if you're going to, they say that what you focus on is what you, where your intentions go is where your focus goes is where your intentions go, something like that. If people are disliking President Trump to the extent that they're looking for an alternative, he's probably so in their minds that they're actually going to be finding someone somewhat like him. And it's like the abusive father. The woman with the abusive father usually ends up with an abusive husband. It's a dark side of humanity that we tend to be attracted to, that which has we perceive as having harmed us or been a threat to us. So I think that's one thing that would make Tulsi an anti-Trump candidate. And the Bernie aspect, I just think it's because, and looking at the man, I really do not know why he has appeal. So I could be completely wrong about all of this. And one of these other people could step into the spotlight and sway millions. I just don't see it happening. And again, Tulsi, she might have an opportunity, but there's something about Tulsi that I'm not sure she has the substance. I think she has the personality right now. I think she has the appeal, but I'm not sure that she has the substance to actually do the job. And I think when people are in the privacy of the voting booth, I think that there are only a few things that matter to them. And I think one of the things that they want when they're in the privacy of the voting booth is security. And that is, one of the tipping points here for the Republicans, and one of the top three. And as far as some of these other issues, healthcare, the president in his rally the other night, I think, promised to end AIDS and cancer. And based on alternative media information that we've gleaned over the years, we know that is possible, if not likely. So I think if any of these other issues come to the forefront, he's going to be the one to win votes based on some of these other issues. And as far as the position on Trump, it really depends on the other candidate. Ken, if you're right about the voter turnout being low because nobody really was that enthusiastic about Hillary, we'll have to see if they can come up with somebody that people could get behind to the extent that they would be enthusiastic.
Yeah, well, good points. I think if President Trump comes up with a major solution on healthcare, or maybe the trade war, as we're calling it now, or something like that, he'd actually get conversion votes. But right now, I know people that know how they would never vote for President Trump, and they may not show up at the election, but the conversion factor at this point doesn't look to be as strong. And again, it's because it's a likability thing, not a logical conclusion. But that's hypothetical. Right now, I think the odds are that President Trump does win, but I'm just putting that out there that it's not a foregone conclusion. There's a lot of time left. We have more than a year before November, whatever, 7th or somewhere in that range. But what do you think, Don? Any closing remarks?
Just it's a time for Americans to get involved because this is a key juncture in our history. I would say look not only in the moment, but study a little bit of history and see if you can put all this in perspective and vote your conscience.
So, dear curious seekers and experts, thank you for joining us for this look at these 5 candidates and also the 6th candidate, the anti-Trump. We hope that you have enjoyed this time as we have. And if you have, we would ask you to please click like for this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and share the link to this video. Again, thanks, and until next time, take care.